Skidmore, Missouri, a quiet town where neighbors knew each other by name, where doors were left unlocked, and where justice wasn't always found in a courtroom. But beneath the surface, a decades-long feud simmered, until one summer day in 1981, when an entire town reached its breaking point. A bullet rang out. A notorious bully fell dead in broad daylight, and in the eerie silence that followed, not a single witness would speak. This is the story of Ken McElroy, the man who terrorized the community, only to become the victim of its darkest secret. A secret that remains buried, because everyone agreed to keep it that way. The 1980s were a lawless era in small-town America, not in the way of outlaws, but in the quiet erosion of trust. Police departments, underfunded and overstretched, turned a blind eye to crimes they couldn't or wouldn't solve. Bribes were exchanged, reports went missing, and in some towns, justice wasn't just delayed, it was for sale. But nowhere was this corruption more suffocating than in Skidmore, Missouri. For years, Ken McElroy operated like a shadow ruler. Assault, arson, even child molestation charges would vanish as quickly as they were filed. Rumors swirled of payoffs to deputies, of evidence lost en route to court. The law wasn't just failing Skidmore, it was complicit. And when institutions meant to protect you become part of the terror, people stop asking for justice. They just take it. But here's the dangerous truth. When the system abandons its duty, the line between victim and vigilante blurs. And in that void, there are no trials, only consequences. July 10th, 1981. A day that began like any other in Skidmore. The summer heat clung to the pavement. Cicadas hummed in the tall grass, and the usual faces gathered at the D&G Tavern, nursing their beers in the dim, smoky light. But beneath the surface, the air was electric with something unspoken, a tension so thick it could choke you. Ken McElroy sat at his usual spot, holding court like a king in a town that despised him. He laughed too loud, drank too much, and carried himself with the swagger of a man who dodged the law a dozen times before. And why wouldn't he? The system had failed to stop him, but on this day, something was different. The usual fear in people's eyes had hardened to something else, something dangerous. Unbeknownst to Ken, the clock was ticking. A silent consensus had formed. A reckoning was coming. By the time he stepped out of the bar and into the sunlight, the fate of Skidmore and his own would be sealed forever. The town had reached its breaking point. For decades, he had operated with impunity, a predator who weaponized the legal system against his victims. But in July 1981, something shifted. The whispers grew louder. The stares lasted longer. And in the shadows of Skidmore, a fatal decision was being made, not by strangers, but by the very people whose lives he had destroyed. Take Ernest Bo Bowenkamp, the 70-year-old grocer who had dared to stand up against him. Just months earlier, McElroy had been convicted of shooting Bowenkamp in an attempted murder, his first and only conviction after 21 indictments. Yet even then, the system failed. McElroy walked free on bond, and instead of laying low, he escalated his campaign of terror. He stalked Bowenkamp, harassed his supporters, and even threatened the local Church of Christ minister. And on July 9th, 1981, one day before his death, McElroy walked into the D&G Tavern armed with an M1 Garand rifle and bayonet, openly vowing to finish what he started. Bowenkamp had survived once. He might not survive again. Then there was Romaine Henry, the farmer who had confronted McElroy in 1976 after catching him firing guns on his property. For that act of defiance, McElroy shot Henry twice with a shotgun. The case went to trial, but McElroy's slick lawyer, Richard McFadden, dismantled Henry's credibility, exposing a decades-old petty crime. The jury acquitted McElroy. After that, Henry endured a new kind of torture. McElroy parked outside his home, watching, waiting. Over 100 times, a constant reminder, I own you. And perhaps most chilling of all, Trina McLeod, the child bride McElroy had raped into submission. He first targeted her at 12 years old, impregnated her at 14, and then forced her into marriage to avoid statutory rape charges. When she tried to leave, he burned her parents' house down twice and executed their dogs. By 1981, Trina was trapped, a prisoner in her own home. But others in Skidmore saw what was happening, and some crimes are too monstrous to ignore. So when Ken McElroy walked out of that tavern on July 10, 1981, he wasn't just facing one enemy, he was facing an entire town's wrath. And let's not forget the store owners, the neighbors, the families who endured years of theft, arson, and threats. Any one of them had motive. Any one of them could have decided that if the law wouldn't act, they would. The question wasn't who wanted Ken McElroy dead, it was who didn't. Tuesday, July 10th, 1981, 10:15 a.m. Ken McElroy woke late, the stale heat of a Missouri summer already pressing through the thin walls of his home. He dressed slowly, the weight of his .22 caliber pistol familiar at his hip. Outside, Skidmore stirred, farmers heading to work, shopkeepers unlocking doors. But Ken moved through the town like a shadow, his presence a silent threat. He had court coming up soon for the Bowen Camp shooting, but what did he care? The law had never touched him before. 11:30 a.m. The D&G Tavern's door creaked open as Ken stepped inside, the dim light catching the rifle slung over his shoulder. The usual murmur of conversation stuttered and died. He ordered a beer, smirked at the way the bartender's hands shook. Maybe he'd stop by Bowen Camp's store later. Remind the old man who still ran this town. Let them all see. Conviction or no conviction, Ken McElroy wasn't going anywhere. 1 p.m. Trina slid into the passenger seat of Ken's pickup, her silence as heavy as the humidity. She knew better than to ask where they were going. Across the street, a group of men, faces Ken recognized, men he'd stolen from, threatened, or worse, stood clustered outside the Legion Hall. Their eyes followed him. For once, they didn't look away. 2:45 p.m. The truck idled on Main Street, Ken's fingers drumming the steering wheel. He noticed the cars pulling in, the way the sidewalks had filled with people. Too many people. No one approached. No one spoke. Just watching. A prickle crawled up his neck. Were they daring him? He reached for his rifle and froze. 3 p.m. The first shot cracked the air. Then another. And another. Glass shattered as bullets tore through the driver's side window. Ken lurched, his body slamming into Trina. Not protection, just reflex. The world blurred. Screams, running, footsteps, the metallic stink of blood. Somewhere in the haze, a thought flickered. This can't be happening. Not to him. Not in his town. 3:02 p.m. Silence. Ken's head slumped against the horn, the blare cutting through the sudden stillness. Around the truck, 30, 40, maybe 50 people stood frozen. No one rushed to help. No one even called for an ambulance. Just a sea of blank faces, watching as the man who terrorized them for decades bled out in the July sun. 3:15 p.m. The first sirens wailed in the distance. By then, the crowd had already begun to dissolve. Men slipping into alleys, women ushering children inside. By the time the sheriff arrived, the only witness left was Trina, her clothes stained with her husband's blood. And when asked who fired the shots, she said she didn't know. And neither did anyone else. Justice is supposed to be blind, impartial, cold. But in Skidmore, justice had eyes, and it had been watching Ken McElroy for decades. The law had its chance. 21 indictments, 21 escapes. Even when the system finally clenched its fists around him, that one fleeting conviction for shooting old Bo Bowenkamp, it loosened its grip, let him walk, let him breathe, let him load his rifle and stroll into the bar the day before his death, promising more bloodshed. The law had failed Skidmore, so Skidmore became the law. That's the thing about fate. We like to pretend it's some cosmic force, spinning its threads beyond our control. But sometimes fate is just a choice, a collective decision, whispered in glances across the tavern, tightened fingers around gun stocks in the dark. That day, fate wore work boots. It drove a pickup. It stood silently on Main Street, watching, waiting, until the moment it reached down and pulled the trigger. Ken McElroy spent his life believing he was untouchable, and in the end, he was right. The law couldn't touch him, but the people, they didn't just touch him, they erased him. So here's the question that lingers like gun smoke over Skidmore. When the system breaks down, when the innocent are prey and the guilty go free, what is justice really? A courtroom? A jury? Or just a quiet street where the monsters finally meet the consequences they spent a lifetime outrunning?